Hello YouTube, let's talk about part 3 of my video series on fixing Elite Dangerous, and this time it would be fixing PowerPlay. And to me it would only be about integrative gameplay as opposed to separate layers. Honestly, at this point in time, if I had my choice, I would just develop an external threat in lore and eliminate PowerPlay altogether until it could be revamped. And personally, I would replace it with a game mode or gameplay option that I would call dub colonization that I'll go to in my next video. But in reality, well, to be honest, I would still do that. The problem is, PowerPlay as it exists today is a separate added layer of grind. It doesn't have any interconnection with the background sim, and it leads to logical inconsistencies in the universe itself, where you have let's say a system that is dominated by a federal or federation minor power being exploited and controlled by an imperial subpower or an imperial PowerPlay faction, without any real consequence either for PowerPlay, it seems, or the background simulation. And it just doesn't make any sense. It would seem that if you're a federal system that is being controlled by an imperial faction, you should be in some sort of state of occupation or something like that, and it should affect what's going on in the background sim, and what's going on in the background sim should affect how many credits or PowerPlay capital points the PowerPlay faction gets. Now, there are commanders out there who like PowerPlay and are now invested, especially with the rise of Power and a player group, the EG Pilots and Yuri Grom, being promoted and elevated to a major power within the PowerPlay structure. So I don't think that you're going to be able to eliminate PowerPlay at this point in time without, I don't want to say significant repercussions, but at least there would be some repercussions from those people who spent time and effort trying to do the whole PowerPlay thing over the past year. And last year, when things were going on, like the rise of power of Lagivny Duval, or Arissa Lagivny Duval, to the Emperor's throne and the Empire, and the presidential thing between the Federation factions, and I don't know if anything was going on with the others, but there at least was a little bit of a driving, motivating factor, in lore at least, to engage in PowerPlay. When I came back after kind of a summer hiatus, and really a hiatus the first part of this year from playing Elite Dangerous, I dropped my PowerPlay faction because there was just no reason. It was more of a hindrance than it was of assistance. Going about my daily business of trying to get trade rank or one of my ranks up to Elite in the Pilots Federation and getting enough rank to get an Imperial Cutter. You know, it didn't help either of those causes, so I dropped my PowerPlay affiliation. And that is the biggest problem with PowerPlay right now. Now, my solution would be to rebuild PowerPlay based on background sim mechanics rather than as a separate layer of grind. I would move military rank based on the subpower pledge, similar to how you have the tiered structure now for PowerPlay. That would be replaced by your military rank. Merits would become political currency for favors and PowerPlay gear. How would this work with PowerPlay background sim mechanics? Well, minor factions would be given allegiances to the various PowerPlay factions. Say you have a system with 4 Imperial powers in it, or minor factions. Maybe one's pledged to Arissa Lagivny Duval, maybe another one to Denton Petraeus, another one to Aisling Duval, another one to Torval. You know, that would be how you would buy for power in a system. If a system is controlled by the Federation and you're an Imperial power like ALD and you want to invade that system, you would need to do it via one of two ways. You would either need to use the background sim system in order to trigger one of your systems that do have your powers nearby to expand in that system, or you would launch an invasion using PowerPlay-esque mechanics. PowerPlay factions would generate PowerPlay missions as well to bring in supplies for troops, gain influence, maybe flip allegiances, and Civil War expansion in other states would be triggered via the background sim. You would take control of neighboring systems and there would be a PowerPlay income cost associated with their upkeep, and that would also be determined a little bit by system states. If they're in lockdown or civil unrest, civil war, it would create supply the troop missions, garrison missions in the PowerPlay section, and it would affect the background sim production rates and thus capital given to the controlling power. And this would be tied to supply levels, as I kind of discussed a little bit in the background sim video, and I'm going to go into more depth into this in the colonization video, and how supply levels would really, you would need to be shown this in the background simulation, and then I will explain how it would all work more in colonization, because it would be very important for that gameplay mode that I would be proposing. The missions you would do, and these would be missions that you would find at the bulletin board under a PowerPlay section, or for a minor faction, and it would say PowerPlay missions, and you would have to be pledged to that particularly allied power in order to be able to do those missions, or to do counter missions for another power if there are competing powers in a system. You would earn credits, and you would earn Pilots Federation rank as well, plus merits for PowerPlay store equipment, gear, favors, things of that nature. So basically, doing missions would net you influence and grind throughout all of the grinding tier systems as there were, maybe with the exception of the engineers. But as far as your Pilots Federation rank goes, your military rank goes, as well as influencing the game simulation in the background as a whole, would all be done via basically missions that would affect all of that. Systems could be contested via 3 ways. You could get a loyal minor power to expand in the system via the background simulation. Maybe you could flip the allegiance of an existing faction using PowerPlay missions. Maybe bribery, maybe instigating a coup with intelligence, faulty intelligence, kind of how ALD does her corruption reports. And then you could launch an invasion. And if other powers are present, they could launch a defensive fleet to defend against it. And you would have your weekly tax collection or tithing, whatever you want to call it, basically adding up of points that you would get. And this would be the same mechanic that is in play today. Basically every Thursday morning the system goes down, all of that is recalculated as the maintenance happens and goes back online. So this would be really not doing a whole lot to changing the way necessarily that PowerPlay works from a functional mechanic standpoint. And this would determine the amount of funds and resources you had available in order to basically have capital ship fleets available that the faction could then unleash for invasions the following turn. Now, invasions. This would include 3 stages. Again, this would be somewhat similar to the existing PowerPlay structure and mechanics. You'd have your preparation stage, which this would honestly just be an ongoing, essentially community goal each turn to deliver supplies to the capital in order to supply these fleets. And the supply level of the fleets basically determines what kind of ships and stuff show up at conflict zones. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the attack defense stage, which would be the actual launching into a system, and then the aftermath stage the following week. The preparation stage, as I said, would act much like a community goal for the PowerPlay faction's capital system, and supply levels would have to be given to that area, and maybe it would work more like a community goal, maybe it would work specific supply levels. As I would like to see things, as I've discussed in the background sim, with the way that the economic production would work. And the higher tier that your side reaches that week means the better of quality of ships that will show up on your side in conflict zones. If it's a low supply level that week, they're going to be Imperial Eagles or Imperial Couriers. If you have medium, moderate, average level supplies, you're going to see more Clippers, Couriers, maybe a cutter or 2. If you have very high supply levels, well, then you're going to see more Cutters, maybe Pythons, as well as mostly Clippers and very few smaller ships. And it would award merits as well as credits. Again, this would help out both your trade rank as well as your merit rank. And I would include another type of mission, new type of mission, called scouting. Basically, you go to a system, you go into a POI that's generated, that's like a convoy POI, a military checkpoint, and your job in there is to scan the ships with a cargo scanner to see what they're carrying. And then you bring that information back. Maybe it's part of the prep stage in which it helps your exploration rank as well as gives you credits and merits. So that way you could do missions depending on maybe what you're working on personally at the time. If you're needing to and wanting to increase your exploration rank, well, you would do scouting missions. If you wanted to increase your trade rank, you would do, bring supply missions. If you wanted to increase your combat rank, you would be doing the conflict zones and the attack zones and stuff of that nature. So factors like that. In the attack and defend stage, players would vote much like they do now for expansion, and you would get a number of votes depending on your rank, and where to send fleets for the next turn, essentially. And maybe your side finds out that Hudson's going to attack this system, and maybe you decide that you want to send one of your fleets instead of on attack for defense. And these would trigger naval conflict zones. These would be point of interest in the system that would be specifically labeled. Furthermore, they would not show up unless you were pledged to the appropriate powers. So independent pilots may be not able to show up. Now, if you're invading in an independent system that has no other PowerPlay factions present, then maybe it would trigger to where anybody that is a rival PowerPlay faction could join in and join the opposite side against you and hand in those credits or hand in those bounties and stuff for the appropriate level of merits, etc., so on and so forth. The attacking faction would have a capital class ship in their zones. Defenders would only have a capital class ship if another PowerPlay faction sent a fleet to defend. And it would work like current community goal PowerPlay conflict zones, crime sweeps, etc., so on and so forth. The side that does the most herding of cats within that week and cashes in the most merits would be the side that would be dubbed the winner. And then you would reach the aftermath stage. If the attack was successful, if the attacking invading force was successful, a new default power minor faction will be added that is loyal to the PowerPlay faction and would be given 51% control of that system. It would cause unrest and other negative consequences for all of the factions, including the one that was just entered into the simulation, as they would be considered, quote, occupied. That would be a new game system state that would have to be added into the game. What all would be contributing factors there are things and details that, you go down a rabbit hole when you start talking about all of the nitty-gritty details that would have to be considered for this to work. And this would generate PowerPlay missions to fortify the new minor faction with troops and supplies and military supplies, as well as missions to win the hearts and minds of existing factions in the system, maybe bringing in things, luxury goods like Lavian brandy, things of that nature. The defending fleet will have lost one of their fleets, causing a morale hit for that faction that lost throughout their systems. Now, if they had more victories than losses, maybe it doesn't have that great of an impact, but if they lost all their fleets in a turn, basically production levels throughout all of their controlled systems are going to go down. Discontentment from society is going to go up and lead to more civil unrest and things like that, and could make things very, very difficult. So there would be a strategic element involved in whether or not you deploy a fleet. And I would say, even as far as that goes, powers would have the option of not committing any fleets and maybe building up resources to have more fleets, so whenever they decide to go on to an offensive, they can commit and maybe do 10 attacks at some time. There would be elements of strategy and stuff sprinkled in throughout that. Again, I don't have a monopoly on ideas, so if you have anything, put them down in the comment section down below. The aftermath stage of a defense is successful. The attacking fleet is lost, and that PowerPlay faction takes an economic hit for the next term, as factored in with all the BGS, as I was just talking, is just the opposite would happen, as I was discussing in the previous slide. The system that is attacked would be put into lockdown and or other negative states, and it would generate relief missions and donations, and the winning side would get merits as well as credits for doing those missions, or if you lost credits, maybe you would gain merits that could be basically, again, redeemed for credits and things like that from the PowerPlay store, for lack of a better term. And there's other considerations here. You're going to have to add probably a war zone state, an occupied state for the PowerPlay operations for the invasion. And maybe instead of war zone, that should be invasion state. How refugees or mercenaries could affect things. This rabbit hole goes very, very deep. There's a lot of things here that would have to be considered, discussed, mathematical formula developed to express all of this and how it would work. and balanced. This is going to be a complex undertaking that is not going to happen overnight if it were to be adopted by Frontier and FDev. What it would do, however, is add strategic elements to the game. It also give players a sense of agency to adopt maybe a fixed base of operations or a forward operating base for a time to get to know a system, at least for a little while. And it would make the background sim and PowerPlay interconnected and affect each other. And I think that is the biggest draw of what I'm proposing, at least to me. And it also makes those grinds interconnect. You're gaining rank with the Pilots Federation as you're grinding your military rank and hopefully getting power rank, as well, or security clearance and all that stuff, all at the same time. And it all is covered by doing one set of missions if you're pledged to a PowerPlay faction. So that would also give players an encouragement to want to do PowerPlay, because then instead of having to grind these things separately, maybe you could do more of them at the same time by being in a PowerPlay faction. So I think that would lessen the grind to a degree, and you're making credits, you're making merits, you're doing all your grinds at the same time in an integrated fashion. I think that would, people are still going to bitch about the grind, but I think that they would do a little bit less so if things were somewhat more integrated. Now, military rank. Again, I would convert the existing structure into security clearance, and that would cover ties to system permits and current faction ships. You would get a new military rank based on the current PowerPlay pledge system, where there would be 5 tiers, 6 tiers, 10 tiers, however that would end up working. I still think that this system would need to be tweaked as far as numbers go. But again, if there's an encouragement and a reason that you're doing the PowerPlay grind, affects your Pilots Federation rank and your other factors, your security clearance and things of that nature, it would make grinding the number of merits you would need to attain your military rank, it wouldn't be an exclusive grind. You could be doing that at the same time as you're doing other things. So I don't think it would be as bad as it is currently right now, where you have to either do PowerPlay or work on your personal pilot's profile. You can do very little to do the same or there's very little you can do to do both at the same time, really. New ranking system, you could only be pledged to one military power at a time, earns a weekly salary based on rank, credits. Rank would degrade over time. I would put a mechanic in there that you could assign for leave. Let's say, Battlefield 1 was coming out. For the next 2-3 weeks, you're going to be playing a lot of Battlefield 1, not a lot of Elite Dangerous. So you could request maybe up to a 2-turn leave of absence, in which your rank would not degrade, but if you don't log in after that, your rank would start to take a hit for being AWOL, or absent without leave, much like you would in the real military. It would allow you to trade merits for favors. They've talked about this a little bit. I would say PowerPlay modules as well as PowerPlay faction ships. Again, I would come out with like a War Cutter, or a War Cutter, or a War Clipper, or a War FDL, or a specialized faction ships, and I would base these largely on existing ships that would just have a special extra feature added in on them. Again, you get into balancing discussions, balancing issues, but I would also keep it that you can only buy these ships or rebuy these ships so long as you remain pledged to the power. If you have a War Cutter and you decide to drop PowerPlay faction and you lose that War Cutter, maybe you get the insurance cost minus the rebuy, or you get replaced with a standard cutter, but you have to still be part of that faction in order to gain that ship. I know that's not going to be popular with everyone, but I think that would give kind of an incentive to stay allied with a power over time. And then, of course, you could trade it in for AI wingmen to show up and help you out in a combat zone, for instance. Rebuy insurance, maybe you could cover, spend so many merits and they would cover your rebuy for doing a PowerPlay mission or something like that. Credits, and then, hey, I can trade in 500 merits for 1,000,000 credits. Just for straight hard, cold cash, homie. Make the mercenaries happy if you want to roleplay as a mercenary. Leaving a power, you'd have 2 options. Mustering out. Your remaining merits would be cashed out for credits at that time. Your rank would be lost. Maybe if you're re-enlisted at a later time, you would start at Tier 2 instead of Tier 1. Maybe. Ability to access the merit modules and ships would be lost. If you lost your ship with the merit module on board, well, you wouldn't get it back. I know some people wouldn't like that, but that's how I would do it in order to kind of give another incentive to stay pledged to a power over time. Defection, your merits would be replaced with the new faction's merit. They would give you maybe even a 10 or 20% bonus for coming over to the dark side because they have cookies. And a bounty equal to the number of merits would be placed on your head. Now, that bounty of merit can only be rescinded after another player kills you. And it would be one of those things that it would only be redeemable by the faction that you left. So let's say you leave ALD for Zachary Hudson, and an ALD player eventually kills you, and you had 20,000 merits. Well, they would get those 20,000 merits that then they could cash in for credits or ships or favors or whatever else. Again, it's like, well, what happens if you leave a power and just stick in solo and open play or a private group? Well, so be it. I guess that bounty would remain on your head, and anytime that you went into open and somebody collected it on you, it would remain. Again, if you never went into open again, I guess it really wouldn't affect you that much, but, things of that nature. Maybe even after you leave the other power, because of that bounty, you're still getting hunted by NPCs or something in those other game modes, and fleets of NPCs, 2 or 3 elite FDLs. I would not make it easy. I would make the repercussions for leaving a faction via defection. Conclusion? Well, to me, this would make PowerPlay a little bit more logically consistent within the universe, and it would make integrated gameplay, and I think it would give people an incentive to actually engage in PowerPlay. Now, that's not to say that there isn't going to be problems. I mean, there's still a lot of factors to consider. That would have to be for balance. It would also require a commitment of man hours on the part of Frontier to basically put towards doing this. I don't know how many man hours, but I have a feeling it would be significant. And this is something that I don't think could be done in 3 months or 4 months. I'm thinking that this is something that would have to be done over at least 6 months to a year. And maybe elements of this are rolled out over time. I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, but this is one of those things that, to minimize that, I've tried to include as many of the existing PowerPlay functions as they exist today, but having to integrate it back with background sim, that's going to be complicated because you're going to be adding another set of variables on top of the already complexity, the existing complexity of the background sim. And that can take time to get right without bugs and things like that. So, yeah, I wouldn't think that this would even be on the board until probably a very earliest 3.0, which would be sometime probably this time next year, in all honesty. At the very earliest next summer of 2017. But that would be what I would be striving towards if I was Frontier Developments. Now I want to say thank you very much for watching. I don't have a monopoly on ideas. You may be able to point out things where I've overlooked things in the comment section below, ideas that you may have had or you may have in order to make this area of gameplay better and more incentivized for engaging in it for average run-of-the-mill players. Maybe you absolutely hate what I have to propose here and would do something completely different. Well, put them in the comment section down below. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video around the interwebs. I think the more people who see it and can give feedback and maybe can, get it in front of Frontier more, hey, all the better. Until next time, be sure to stay tuned for my video on a new gameplay mode that, frankly, if I had my way, I would eliminate PowerPlay completely and replace it with colonization, but I realize the reality of the situation is with players invested at this point in time, that's not going to happen. So this would be how I would fix PowerPlay, and I think most people would agree that it would solve a lot of, not all, but it would solve a lot of the problems people have with PowerPlay, myself included. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the colonization video tomorrow.